director of Cine City, the Brighton Film Festival. And this panel discussion, which follows our 1984 documentary, is to provide some insights into Schwankmayer's his career, his themes, and obviously we'll reflect upon the documentary, because the documentary is a very specific thing, given its origins in 1984, at a time when Schwankmajer still was very, very new. It's interesting, isn't it, thinking about kind of those moments in film history. Here we are in 2013, you could think, oh, we have a very good purchase on, for example, Eastern European animation. But to imagine 30 years ago not having that was so interesting about the 1980s as a result of the work of Keith Griffiths. Is that Schwankmayer's films literally are imported to this country for the first time. They become part of the British Film Institute's distribution catalogue. They're available in 35 and 16. So it meant suddenly this material, which was new material, could be seen in cinemas, in colleges, etc. So it's interesting how there's certain points in film history when, if you like, kind of doors are unlocked and you start seeing new things for the first time. Now, with me to talk about Schwankmajer is Dr. Teresa Stelikova.
Yes.
Stelikova is much better. And Teresa wrote her thesis at the Royal College of Art, in which she looked at notions of haptic space, how objects can embody particular memories, a cinema of the tactile. And she'll say more about that as we speak with her. And Michael Brook is a freelance writer. For many years was at BFI, contributed to Film Online, regular contributor to Sight and Sound. And his interests are in British cinema, but in particular Central and Eastern European cinema. So thank you for being here. I guess my first question, and we'll speak for a bit, and then if you have questions, you can please ask us, and we'll see what we can do with some answers. My first question would be, if you had the opportunity to make a Schwankmajer documentary, and having seen that one, how would you do it differently? Michael?
It's a tricky one, actually. I mean, I've just seen that on the big screen for the first time, and I do think it's an absolutely extraordinary piece of work, considering I didn't see it when it was first broadcast, and I'd love to know what people made of it when it was first broadcast, because, as Frank said, I think there'd been one Schwankmajer film distributed in Britain before then. That was The Flat, which I imagine very, very few people would have seen. And then, of course, you get the Quaid Brothers animation, and again, they weren't that particularly, in fact, they weren't really well known at all, sort of intermingled with the Schwankmajer thing. So I'd love to. I was trying to find out sort of reactions to the documentary when it was shown, and unfortunately I couldn't. Programs like that generally weren't reviewed in any particular depth, and I'd love to know whether people found it sort of exhilarating or baffling or whatever. But what I really loved about it was the fact that that Keith and the Quaids did obey Schwankmayer's exhortation to use their imagination. Yes, how I'd go about something like that. It's, I mean, Keith had the huge advantage of having a couple of world-class animators on hand to bring their, extremely individual and highly distinctive interpretations.
Because if you don't know, there are times in which, in terms of the film, you don't know you're actually looking at Quaid Brothers films and not Schwankmajer, because
Can I ask, do we know how Schwankmajer responded to it? Did he see it, and what did he?
I assume he was. I don't know, to be honest. I really should ask Keith this, actually. Yes, I mean they are great friends. In fact, Keith went on to become executive producer of the vast majority of Schwankmayer's features, and in fact, he was the man who facilitated his move into features. So they're very, very close friends. I assume Schwankmajer appreciated it. It was the first documentary of his work, and he was at the time had his work was being banned left, right, and centre. In fact, Dimensions of Dialogue was not only banned, but because the Czech authorities couldn't work out exactly what they found offensive about it, they just thought it generally felt offensive, they would screen it in closed sessions to other party apparatchiks and other filmmakers as an example of what should not be made. And I imagine Schwankmajer was hugely proud of that when he found out.
Teresa, what are your impressions of the documentary?
Well, it's interesting because I don't think I've actually ever seen it whole. I think I've seen sections of it, and so it was really interesting. And obviously I know a lot about Vankmajer, and I've read a lot of his books and books about him. But I think it's really doing justice to him. I feel I can't think of a better way of doing it in a way. And because he's a difficult man as well.
Well, I was very interested in the fact that it's so, if you like, conditioned, framed by a particular understanding of surrealism and its history. And of course the contributors are all very much part of there was a real interest in exploring surrealism, and a lot of the contributors, including Conrad Maddox and Don Addis, Roger Cardinal, they all contributed to the very big surrealism exhibition, which was the Hayward Gallery in 1979. And it was a sense in which surrealism and its whole history and its international character was kind of being unlocked. Schwankmajer wasn't part of that exhibition, so it's interesting as how that team, if you like, were there to kind of meet Schwankmajer for the first time. But of course there are things which the documentary's not doing. It doesn't really give us a sense of Schwankmajer's life, his biography, a sense of being, if you like, a Czech artist, a Czech animator, an Eastern European animator. So there's a sense of there's a context, if you like, which I think we might want to fill in now, and also too thinking about, which I think is probably when you start to engage with his life, is recognizing how, as an artist, how difficult it was. It's not like the trajectory of a Western European artist who once you start making films and you just continue, that's what you do. But his career is so complicated, especially because of the political interference, the years when he was not allowed to practice. So that creates a very, it's a very particular biography, which is kind of framed by that history.
I mean, you say years when he was not allowed to practice. Of course, the great advantage Schwankmajer had is he works in multiple media. So he was banned from making films in the 70s, but of course he carried on doing lots of other things.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that because, I mean, that kind of ties in with my interest that in those 7 years that he was banned, he basically devoted himself to tactile experiments, which then fed into all his work and actually helped him clarify things. So I don't think he actually ever felt that frustrated even with communism, because actually it kind of provided a friction for him something to fight against.
Could you say something more about his tactile experiments? Because that's something probably we're unfamiliar with. What would be an example of one of his tactile experiments?
Well, he did all kinds of it. He could actually the dimensions of dialogue are a direct result of those experiments. So, for example, he worked with clay a lot. So he did this thing called the gestic sculpture. So this idea that you can imprint emotions into materials, like it's mentioned in the film as well. So with the idea you could punch a piece of clay and it would somehow hold the anger or whatever it is. So he did that. He did all kinds of crazy experiments, because actually there's this book that just being translated into English called Touch and Imagination, which hasn't been translated obviously until now, and I have it in...
It's got a very, very brief English précis in the back, my edition.
Right,
but
yeah.
So
to me it was like, wow, this is the kind of gold, because it just had all these tactile experiments, and sometimes it would be something like that. He would just get up in the morning and he decided to strip naked and blindfolded, or just close his eyes, and just walked around his apartment, sort of experiencing things without seeing them. And actually he's got this very comical episode that he suddenly the doorbell rang and he just went automatically to the door, and it was a postwoman, and because he didn't realize that as he was walking around he actually managed to knock a glass over, and he cut his feet as well, so he was bleeding, and he just this man standing in the door, naked and bleeding. So that was one of his tactile experiments.
What I love about that story is, I mean, it sounds just completely barking mad, but at the same time, it is complete. What he was doing was just completely coherent. He knew exactly what he was trying to experience, trying to achieve, and it's very much a quality that infuses all his not just films, but his work.
Do you think it's the biographer's question, the importance of the being born, brought up in Prague, educated in Prague, that sense of being, underlying, he's a Czech artist, and I know it's very easy to kind of just simplify kind of nationalities, but what makes him a Czech artist? Is that a reasonable question?
Yeah, I mean, I think he absolutely is very Czech, and I've got a sort of intuitive understanding because I grew up in Prague as well, and Prague soaked in this atmosphere, and so he's both that, but he's also very much apart from all the other people there. And I think he always made a point of saying that he's not part of the Czech New Wave. He didn't want to be associated with them, so he's also very much himself. But
would you connect that Czechness to, you think of the that history of puppetry, the connections, the kind of fairy tales, if you like, it's a certain altered kind of culture because of this connections to the fantastic, the mythological. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's growing up, any kind of Czech child, especially from the communist times, it's there. It's part of the stories, the fairy tales. It's absolutely. And I think the other thing with Schwankmajer that he lives. Well, not anymore, but he lived in this Nový Svět, which is this absolutely magical place, just by the Prague castle, in these small streets. So it's just, he had no choice almost. It's absolutely part of him.
And of course, another crucial figure in Czech is, one of the stranger sort of artistic influences you can imagine. But he was this very eccentric Bohemian emperor, who was, in addition to various other things, he was a great patron of the arts. He collected lots of sort of mad things that he would keep in cabinets of curiosities. Giuseppe Arcimboldo was his court painter. And in fact, I went. There was I don't know if you saw it, Teresa, but there was a huge Rudolf II exhibition in Prague. About 15 years ago, and major landmarks in the city was devoted to him. Attempt to try and explain just how embedded in Czech culture Rudolf was, and Schwankmajer very much sort of came out. A lot of his inspirations actually came out of Rudolf and his associates, and this was what, 16th century, late 16th century.
Yeah. And obviously Schwankmajer is now building his own cabinet of curiosities in the Chihuahua Mountains, where he's collecting these incredible fetishes that he's actually even buying on eBay. And we travelled to Africa a few years ago and just been buying things there.
Didn't he run into trouble with customs coming back? Yes.
Yeah, he got caught in the airport and got sniffer dogs, and it got all confiscated. Porcupine, he had like porcupine spikes, and then he had to basically pay to get it all destroyed.
But is this a museum he's working on, or how would you describe what he's building?
Well, basically he's got this incredible castle. It's a castle in the middle of nowhere in the Czech mountains, and so that's where. And he's had that since the 80s. He bought it with his wife at the time. It cost nothing, and he also built another building on the grounds, which is this cabinet of curiosities. And I went there actually in the summer, and I was asking him again, because I was under the impression that he's actually going to maybe open it to the public one day, but he said absolutely not. It's just for him, and whoever has a chance to. If someone's very interested and he kind of realizes that it's serious, he allows people to go, but otherwise he's not interested.
What's very interesting about what's happened recently to him is the way in which there have been many exhibitions in Europe. I think of one in Vienna and Prague, obviously on a smaller scale, the one in Brighton right now, which are working to, if you like, reposition Schwankmajer not just because he's more than just a filmmaker. And for a very long time, we'd always talk about Schwenkmeyer purely in terms of film, because that's all we knew. And what's very interesting is discovering that in fact he's working across media all the time and simultaneously. And I was wondering whether, in terms of your knowledge of him before he makes his first film in 1964, whether it was inevitable that he was going to be a filmmaker, or because he could have been a sculptor, I mean, he could have been a printmaker.
He was certainly, yes. I mean, you can see why he ended up with film, but he trained. He did his degree in puppetry, which at the time I think was the only degree course in puppetry available in the world in Prague. And then from there, he became friends with a man called Emil Radok. They made a film together that Radok directed called Johannes Dr. Faust, which is, I made a point of including that on the BFI DVD. In fact, for purely selfish motives. I'd never seen it, I really wanted to, and it seemed like a good idea, just going out and licensing it. And it turned out to be a really fascinating piece of work. Schwenkmeyer is only credited as one of the puppeteers, but he says that he had a lot more to do with it than the credits suggest, and I believe him. And that would have got him interested in film. And then with Radok, who was one of the founders of the Laterna Magica multimedia theatre of Prague, which had a cause of sensation at the 1958 Expo in Brussels. Schwenkmeyer worked in multimedia theatre, and you can see that in his very first film, The Last Trick. They would often do things against black backdrops and with sort of lighting, just picking out certain details. And you'd also work with film at that, and yes, the films came out of that.
Lantern Magica in Prague was a purpose-built theatre in Prague. Some of you may have been to it, but it's a fascinating history. It's become very touristic over the years, but it's something, as I can remember as a child, I always wanted to go to, because I had an elder cousin who had been to it. I think it was at the Montreal World's Fair in 1967, because he described, it's incredible. You have people on a stage in costume doing things, and then they walk into the screen. And that's a distinctive part of this multimedia, because you're constantly moving from the stage, literally walking into the screen. So a road appears on the screen, and the actors just walk into the screen and walk along that road. And it's the seamlessness of that relationship between the kind of stage and the screen. And that's always made me think about kind of him in the late 50s and 60s. And that movement between, if you like, the actual puppet to the puppet on screen, and that movement, if you like, from the real to the, to the other side.
But I think it ties in with his interest in inanimate objects, as this documentary talks about. So I think that fascination that he had and he still has, and it's kind of connected to him collecting objects, but it's also connected with the marionettes and the puppets. So it's bringing life to things, and then animation, it just seems the most perfect medium to do that, because he becomes like a magician that breathes life into things.
But he doesn't. I mean, one of the things I found fascinating about Schwenkmeyer, he doesn't just work with inanimate objects. He also works with pieces of meat and tongues in particular. Things that were once animate, and brings them back to life in a really unnervingly convincing way.
But how do you reflect on, because the fact that Schwenkmeyer makes his first short film in 1964 and continues right through into the kind of, I guess, early 80s, and then it begins the preparations for features. And it's his 6 feature films, which of course have taken over from his short film production. But moving into the long form, do you think that was kind of inevitable, that the opportunity to actually move towards that, because the feature, of course, it's actually about conceiving of, the 90-minute film, to use the kind of the obvious length of a feature film. But do you think it was inevitable, that move?
Well, I know that what he says that it's not, he doesn't see it as a progression. I think for him it's, he says now my ideas lend themselves to feature length, and maybe next time suddenly I'll want to make a short film. So even though it might not look like it, that's what he says. So I think that ties in with all the other expressions. So sometimes, maybe it's not a film, maybe it's a collage. So he sort of invests as much energy into creating sculptures or ceramic objects, and I don't think he doesn't see it as inferior to the film. And actually, that's connected to what I was mentioning earlier about him. I was asking him, well, what about, are you going to make another feature film or another film? And he can't get funding anymore. And I said, well, this is terrible. What a tragedy for us. We're not going to see another film. And he said, I don't mind. It's fine. I'm just going to be making objects. So to him, it doesn't matter. He just needs to be creative.
What do you think, Michael, about that move? Because what's interesting about the documentary we've seen is, of course, that very much marks the kind of not so much the end of the short film production, but it's that phase is very much coming to an end, and the new phase is about to start.
And in fact, if you have a look at what he was doing in the 80s, you get things. He made a music video. I'm not quite sure how that came about. He made a couple of very, very short films for MTV. I mean, quite clearly the kind of funding for projects in Czechoslovakia was starting to dry up, and there weren't that many alternatives. The BBC commissioned The Death of Stalinism in Bohemia to mark I think it was only a few months after the Velvet Revolution, and then Channel 4, which was still funding a lot of short animation, backed Food, but it was getting increasingly hard to raise money for that kind of thing, and it's very, very hard to actually make your money back on a short film. In fact, slightly tangentially, when I was developing the BFI's Quay Brothers collection, I dug out the original funding application for Street of Crocodiles, in which someone, I assume Keith Griffiths, wrote this wonderfully candid explanation saying, look, we want £80,000 from you, you're not going to make it back, there's absolutely no chance you're going to make you're going to make this back, but we are trying to create a sort of art object that will play in festivals and win awards and bring lots of prestige. And they did fund it, and that's exactly what happened. So with feature films, you do at least have the possibility of commercial international distribution, and the prospect certainly of recouping your investment. I don't imagine Vankmajer cares two hoots about that, but certainly his producers do. But he's been lucky enough to have very close relationships with the same producers, people like Jaromir Kalista and Keith Griffiths and Michael Havas, who've been very, very supportive.
And as you were saying, Teresa, of course, it's interesting to thinking too about because of the changing funding landscape in Europe for filmmakers, whether that actually the potential for a seventh film is actually quite difficult to imagine now, just because there isn't the same, because his producers have been so good at being able to find different pots of funding, from television to but the knowledge of that's drying up also kind of marks a change, but also to the prospect of there not being a seventh film.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what's so ironic that actually in the communist times he had there was more support in a way by the government, by the state, than it is now. So even though he might have made films that he thought would just go straight into a draw, he could make them at least.
And make them with remarkably little interference. I mean, they'd sometimes get banned afterwards, and I think the ossuary was interfered with, but generally, no, they were completed.
In his Decalogue, which is his manifesto, which he wrote in 1999, he says, if you're trying to decide what is more important, the experience of the eye or the experience of the body, always trust the body, because touch is an older sense than sight, and its experience is more fundamental. The experience of the body is more authentic. What does that say to you about his work?
Well, I mean, I think again, Vankmajer is very skeptical. He says the audiovisual culture that we're living in. So his argument is that we bombard it constantly by images and sound, and we become kind of anesthetized. And actually we see, so after this authenticity, which he's trying to get at by various means, and I think touch for him, it's kind of anti-aesthetic almost, or it doesn't matter what it's not about aesthetics, it's about connecting with the kind of basic, and probably with childhood as well, and with memories. So there's a lot, he talks about the idea of embodied memories, so it's both sort of accessing memories of objects, but also the kind of bodily memory of oneself, that's connected with Marinetti as well, the Italian futurists. Again, talks about the idea that when you touch an object, there's some kind of exchange happens between your hand and the object that might kind of bypass your conscious mind. And I think, so all of that's like very kind of, it's the fuel for his imagination.
And tacticity, is that something which you think is, central part of his work?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I mean, as Teresa said, once you know what he was doing in the 70s, the films subsequent to that become something like The Fall of the House of Usher, which is basically a kind of sort of tactile interpretation of the Edgar Allan Poe story, just become that much richer. Though, of course, you can see this interest in the earlier work as well. I mean, we saw clips from The Flat, which is, getting a very, very tactile film. So yes, no, absolutely, though, I agree with that.
The other thing, of course, is to do with montage. It's interesting how Paul Hammond, who was interviewed in the 1984 documentary, he wrote probably one of the earliest studies of Georges Méliès. And so he was very interested in the kind of the beginnings of stop frame animation from 1896, and how early filmmakers were creating the impossible through by those little movements, by taking one picture after another, and actually to create impossible actions. So it's very interesting the way he drew attention to, from early cinema through to vankmajer, because you can see through stop frame animation, and therefore a particular understanding of montage. And it's whether that, of course, is another defining feature of his work.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's quite hard to think of another person who works with animation who has such an aggressive montage, really in-your-face sort of montage technique, which I think is sort of partly inspired by the sort of great Soviet montage artists of the 1920s, and he's really picked up on their ideas, but also he's gone down his own route very much in terms of following his own sort of surrealist preoccupations. But it's, I mean, even when he's filming and editing live action, he has a very individual approach. I mean, for example, quite often someone will be talking, he'll suddenly cut to an extreme close-up of the mouth, uttering a single syllable, and then he'll just cut back to the face again. You're constantly on edge. It's a very, very unsettling effect, and of course that's entirely the effect that he's after.
Are there any Schwankmajerists? Either can you look at his work and look at the relationship between him and other animators, leaving aside the Quays, but I'm thinking about whether there are other, because probably most of us have little purchase on the history of Czech animation, and I wonder whether there are other Czech animators who've been very much inspired by his work.
There are certainly filmmakers who've been inspired by him, but it's quite hard to think of any direct acolytes. I mean, the Quay brothers are very, very keen to deny a frequently repeated rumour that they are sort of slavish fans of Schwankmajer. They say they're not. They only discovered his work in 1982, by which time they're certainly much of their material style has already been established. It's purely because they made that documentary that everyone says, aha, they're paying tribute to their master. In fact, they're very much hoping to dispel that a bit more next year, because I'm putting together a huge Blu-ray box set of the work of Valerian Borovchik, who was probably the biggest influence on their work, and this one they do openly acknowledge. Yeah, in terms of direct influences, I see occasional little Schwankmajer touches in things, but he's got such an incredibly forceful personality that if you imitate him, it's going to be really obvious that you're imitating him.
Because I was thinking the other day about connections between Schwenkmeyer and Tarkovsky. You might not think there's a relationship, but for example, there are dream sequences in Mirror, and you think of kind of Quiet Week in the House. There's some interesting relationships. Not necessarily, whether Tarkovsky saw Schwenkmeyer's work, who knows? But
Probably didn't. I can't see how he would have done.
But there's a really interesting kind of affinity.
And Tarkovsky is also a very tactile filmmaker.
Yes.
Incredibly tactile.
Yes. Would you like to ask a question? We have a roving mic, I think. And there it is.
Stick your hands up.
There's one in the back there.
Thanks. I'm quite interested in the quote you read about the difference between sight and touch. And I wondered if anyone has any ideas about the kind of paradox that emerges when somebody is trying to turn touch into an extremely powerful visual thing. Seeing as he seems to have a sort of see them one as superior to the other, it seems interesting that that sort of emerges in the aesthetic experience of his work.
Teresa.
I suppose, there's this kind of ultimate or contradiction of a filmmaker who is working in audiovisual media yet is sort of promoting tactility, and yet I think it works, and that's what sort of I got intrigued by. And actually there's this film, one of the kind of main films that are based on his tactile experiment, called Conspirators of Pleasure, which is a feature film, which is very funny and actually quite accessible feature film. And I think that's when I realized that actually you can communicate touch in this kind of visceral way that actually touches the body. And so I did a screening of it. So there was audience, and I've asked people to fill in questionnaires afterwards and get responses, and there was definitely a kind of agreed response of people being very affected in the body and in the tactile sense, a kind of heightened tactile sense. So it's the idea of evocation of touch through.
Because one of the characters in Conspirators of Pleasure is this sort of tactile fetishist, really. He, every time he sees anything with a really interesting texture, like he'll get into a lift and there's a woman with a sort of fox fur around her neck, and he'll just look at that, and then there'll be these opera arias of bursting out in his head. And he sort of steals various, a bit like Schwenkmeyer himself, he sort of takes various things with interesting textures, sticks them to things like rolling pins and so on, which is, he was doing that in the 70s, wasn't he? There's weird sort of tactile things that you run over your body.
Oh yeah, those, yeah.
And that ended up in the film. That's another film that related directly to his tactile experiments.
Well, testing ground's interesting because if you are going to move into a polysensual space, is that possible? Because you have little or no dialogue. You're also choosing to, often with the short films, to abandon narrative. so you're into a different, not just a different visual world, but if the polysensuality is working, you're actually into a different sensual world as well. It's to what extent this is but as you were speaking, Teresa, I was thinking to what extent, if you like it, there's a lot of surrealism is actually about this. It is about experimentation, and it's actually conceiving of different places to go to and how to get there. And it's about using objects in a particular way. It's about editing in a particular way. So whether this is part of a, kind of a project to change us, to kind of alter us. Does that make sense?
Well, I just want to say, well, the other very important element, of course, about Vankmajer is his interest in psychoanalysis and Freud, and I think some of these methods are ways of from accessing the unconscious as well, so through touch or through whatever means.
But she is much more Jungian because she speaks in archetypes.
But it's funny, I asked him, I said, are you Jungian or are you Freudian? He said, definitely Freud.
What about his last movie?
Oh, exactly, yes.
In contrast.
If you haven't seen Surviving Life, it's basically there's a psychoanalyst's office and it's got portraits of Freud and Jung that regularly come to life and beat each other up.
Is there another question? Yes, there's some hands.
Have you got any comments about its use of sound and its collaboration with musicians? Because it's quite extreme sometimes, and I'd just be interested to know sort of how he worked with sort of music and musicians on some of these films. Because I actually closed my eyes sometimes when I was watching some of the shorts. It's actually quite interesting just listening to them. They're quite extreme, some of those sounds.
He had a very long-term collaboration with a Czech composer called Zdeněk Liška, who is sort of amazingly prolific, amazingly versatile composer who largely wrote for Czech cinema. And in fact, some of the greatest Czech film scores, things like he wrote Markéta Lazarova, amongst many other things. He had this. I think they started in. I think it was Punch and Judy, so '66, and ended with Castle of Otranto. And Schwankmajer said of Liška that he had this extraordinary ability to discover rhythms in my work that I didn't know were there. And they had such a close creative partnership that when Liška fell ill and died, Schwankmajer had a great deal of difficulty finding a replacement. He worked with Jan Klusak on Fall of the House of Usher and Dimensions of Dialogue, but I don't think they hit it off to anything like the same extent. And at that point, he said he actually felt an aversion to music. And you can see it in the films. Sometimes he won't have music at all, sometimes he'll just have sort of library music, and then the sound gets much more intensified. Especially in sort of things like Alice, which I think has got no music at all, but really incredibly intense use of sound and sound effects, deliberately exaggerated.
And do you know if there was a creative dialogue with his composers, or were they just allowed to get on with it?
I would assume someone like Liška was just allowed to get on with it. Liška's just. The more Liška scores I hear, the more absolutely bowled over I am by his inventiveness. He seemed to be able to come up with pretty much any kind of music you could possibly want for any occasion, and that's I don't know how much he worked. He could sort of compose the music in advance, if at all. I suspect possibly not, given how prolific he was.
And Teresa, do you think that the tacticity, to what extent do you think the music actually contributes to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important, and if you pay attention to, the sort of heightened sound effects of a lot of the tactility is achieved through the sound. So there's also kind of, even in Dimensions of Dialogue, the material, the sound of grinding, it's absolutely vital.
As is the fact that we can actually see the fingerprints in the clay.
Thank you. There was another one at the back there.
Can you explain the connections? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Between there's an extraordinary connection between Janáček and Kafka and Schwankmajer and the Black Theatre of Prague. I mean, how much are these connected? And is there a current stream of this sort of darkness in Czech art?
Well, I think obviously they are very connected. I think some of it must be, that's just my speculation, to do with the city. And again, if we take the example of Schwankmayer's idea of embodied memory and the idea of kind of memory living in spaces and in architecture, I think, of course, living there, growing up there, it will imprint itself. I think there's no way it can't. But as for what's happening now, that's more difficult. I think there are people who still carrying that tradition, some very talented. So, for example, there's a Czech artist, very versatile artist called František Skala, and he's a sculptor, musician. He does puppet theatre as well. Very, very different from Schwankmajer. But I'd say, yeah, there's someone with spirit that I'd. Otherwise, I think there's a kind of dilution as well going on. Maybe because of this thing that Schwankmajer talks about, that the enemy is somehow dispersed and there's no obvious thing to fight against, and people, some kind of dissipation of focus that I feel when I go.
And also, we no longer have to make an effort to see these things. I mean, obviously, it's much rarer to get a chance to see them on the big screen like here, but of course now you can get hold. I mean, I remember trying to see as many of Schwankmayer's films as possible in the 1980s. I think I managed to notch up about half to 2/3 by then, but they were, very, very hard to see, particularly the ones that needed subtitling. So I noticed those ones that BFI didn't distribute.
There's so much to explore with Schwankmajer, and really kind of an hour isn't enough. However, if you look in your Cine City programme, I'm sure you all have a copy, you'll know that Michael's giving a lecture on Schwankmajer next week, so we hope to see you there.
Heavily illustrated, I should probably add.
And I think kind of is montage and collage is
that's certainly one of the main topics.
Excellent. And of course our screenings of Schwankmajer hasn't come to an end, because there's still some of the shorts and still some of the features to be seen. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Therese and Michael.